Hi guys! During the time that came to be known as the late period of ancient Egypt, which began around the year 700 before the Common Era, the way in which pharaohs chose their spouses began to shift in small and gradual ways. These changes were not sudden or dramatic, but rather they unfolded slowly over many years, almost without notice. The marriages of the rulers were not usually based on personal feelings or emotional connections, but instead were shaped by the needs of the state and the desire to maintain stability in a time of uncertainty. It was common for a pharaoh to marry a woman from another region or kingdom, not because he wished to, but because it was believed that such a union might help to prevent conflict or strengthen an alliance. These marriages were arranged by advisors, priests, and officials who spent long hours discussing the possible benefits and risks of each potential match. The process was often slow and filled with formalities, with many meetings held in quiet rooms where little was said that had not been said before. The women who became queens through these marriages often came from places outside of Egypt, such as Assyria, Babylon, or regions in what is now Libya. Their arrival in Egypt was marked by ceremonies that lasted for days, though these events were not always joyful or filled with celebration. Instead, they followed a strict order of steps that had been used for generations. There would be a procession through the city, with the new queen riding in a covered litter carried by servants. The streets would be cleaned the night before, and offerings would be placed at temples along the route. Priests would chant in low voices, repeating the same phrases over and over, while the people stood quietly and watched. There was little music, and even less dancing. The mood was serious, as if everyone understood that this was not a moment of personal happiness, but a necessary act of state. Once the marriage had taken place, the queen would take on certain duties at the royal court. She would appear at official events, sit beside the pharaoh during ceremonies, and participate in religious rituals. Her role was not to make decisions or influence policy, but to be present, to be seen, and to fulfill the expectations that had been set long before her arrival. She would wear the traditional headdress and robes, which were heavy and uncomfortable, and she would speak only when spoken to. Her daily life was highly structured, with little variation from one day to the next. She would rise at the same time each morning, eat the same meals, and follow the same path through the palace corridors. There were no surprises in her routine, and that was considered a good thing. The pharaoh himself did not spend much time with his foreign wife. His days were filled with meetings, inspections of construction projects, and religious obligations. He would see her during formal meals or at temple festivals, but their interactions were brief and polite. There was no expectation of affection between them, and no one spoke of love in connection with their union. Instead, the focus remained on the children they might produce, for it was through offspring that the line of rulers could continue. If a child was born, especially a son, it was seen as a sign that the marriage had served its purpose. If no child came, the situation was accepted without complaint, and the pharaoh might take another wife or simply continue without one. Over time, these marriages became a regular part of political life in Egypt. Each new ruler followed the same pattern, choosing a spouse based on where she came from and what her family could offer, rather than who she was as a person. The names of the queens were recorded in official documents, but little else was written about them. They did not lead armies, give speeches, or make laws. Their presence was a formality, a symbol of unity between two lands, but not a source of power or change. The records that mention them are brief and dry, listing only their names, their origins, and the dates of their marriages. There are no stories of their thoughts or feelings, no accounts of private conversations or moments of joy. They exist in the historical record as quiet figures, moving through the background of a much larger and slower process. As the years passed, the practice of marrying foreign women continued, but it did not bring lasting peace or security. Alliances formed through marriage often broke down after a few years, sometimes even before the queen had adjusted to life in Egypt. War still happened, borders still shifted, and the power of the pharaohs remained uncertain. The marriages did not stop invasions or prevent internal conflicts. They were simply one of many tools used by rulers who were trying to hold on to authority in a changing world. And yet, the tradition persisted, not because it worked, but because it had always been done that way. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing that each new pharaoh would follow the same steps, say the same words, and make the same choices as those who came before. The temples where these marriages were sometimes blessed stood for centuries, their walls covered in carvings that showed kings and queens standing side by side, hands resting gently on ceremonial objects. The images were always the same, the pharaoh slightly taller, the queen slightly behind, both looking forward with calm expressions. No one smiled in these carvings, and no one appeared to be in motion. They were frozen in time, part of a scene that was meant to last forever, even though the people it represented had long since disappeared. The stone did not show the long silences, the cold rooms, or the weight of expectation that filled the lives of those who lived through these unions. It only showed the surface, the part that was meant to be seen. In the end, the marriages of the late period pharaohs were not about passion, or even about partnership. They were about continuity, about maintaining a system that had existed for hundreds of years. They were quiet, predictable, and uneventful, exactly what was needed in a time when too much change could lead to collapse. And so, year after year, decade after decade, the same process repeated itself, with little variation and even less excitement. The sun rose and set, the Nile flooded and receded, and the pharaohs took their brides from distant lands, not because they wanted to, but because it was the way things had always been done. The practice of marrying within the royal family was not new during the years between 700 and 200 before the Common Era, but it became more common and more accepted as time passed. It was not a sudden change, nor was it something that people discussed in great detail. Instead, it was simply a part of how things were done, like the way offerings were made at temples or how officials recorded the harvest each year. When a pharaoh chose a wife from among his own relatives, it was not seen as unusual or strange. It was seen as normal, as expected, as the way to keep the royal bloodline pure and undisturbed by outside influence. The idea was that power and authority should remain within the family, not be shared with people from other regions or other lineages. This belief was quiet but strong, like a current beneath the surface of a slowly moving river. Most often, these internal marriages involved a brother and a sister, or sometimes a man and his half-sister. The children born from such unions were considered to be of the highest status, because both parents carried the royal title and the sacred connection to the gods. There was no concern about the health of the children or the long-term effects of such unions. These ideas did not exist in the way they do today. Instead, people believed that the royal family was different from ordinary people, that they were protected by divine favor, and that their blood was not subject to the same rules as others. The gods had married among themselves in the old stories, and so it made sense that the pharaoh, who was seen as a living god, should follow the same pattern. The marriages themselves were quiet events. There was no large celebration, no public festival, no procession through the city. The ceremony took place in a small room within the palace, often in the early morning when the light was soft and the air was cool. A priest would be present, dressed in plain linen, and he would speak in a low voice, reciting words that had been used for generations. The bride would wear a simple white robe, and the groom would wear the same ceremonial collar he wore every day. There were no rings, no exchange gifts, no vows that required emotion or personal promise. The act was formal, brief, and final. Once it was done, the couple would return to their usual routines, as if nothing had changed. Life after the marriage followed a predictable path. The wife would move into a room near the pharaoh's chambers, but they did not spend much time together. Their interactions were limited to official appearances, religious duties, and occasional meals held in the presence of court officials. There was little conversation between them, and even less affection. The purpose of the marriage was not companionship, but continuity. The hope was always that a child would be born, preferably a son, who could one day take the throne. Until that happened, the queen would continue her duties, which included making offerings at temples, overseeing the royal household, and appearing in carvings and inscriptions that showed her standing behind the pharaoh. The children who were born from these marriages were raised in a highly controlled environment. They did not play with other children, nor did they leave the palace grounds except for rare ceremonial occasions. Their days were filled with lessons in reading, writing, and religious practice, all taught by elderly tutors who spoke slowly and repeated the same information many times. There was no music, no games, no laughter in their education. Discipline was calm but constant, and any sign of disobedience was met with silence, not punishment. The goal was not to make them happy, but to make them ready. They were being prepared for a life of duty, not freedom. As the years passed, the pattern repeated itself with little variation. Each new pharaoh, when he came to power, would often marry a sister or a close female relative. The reasons for this were never explained in detail, but they were understood by everyone involved. It was tradition. It was stability. It was the way to avoid conflict with other noble families who might otherwise claim a share of power through marriage. By keeping the royal line closed, the rulers believed they were protecting the throne from outside influence and internal division. There was no debate about whether this was right or wrong. There was only the quiet acceptance that this was how things had always been done. The temples and monuments built during this time often showed images of the royal family standing together in neat rows, each figure slightly smaller than the one before, as if to show their place in the order of things. The pharaoh stood at the front, the queen slightly behind, and the children arranged in a line to the side. Their faces were calm, their hands held in the same position, their clothing identical in style. These images were carved into stone with great care, but they did not capture any sense of individuality. No one smiled. No one looked to the side. They all faced forward, as if looking into a distant future they would never see. There were no records of private conversations between the members of these families. No letters, no diaries, no personal reflections have survived, if they ever existed. The official documents only mention births, deaths, marriages, and temple offerings. They do not speak of love, or conflict, or longing. They do not describe the long afternoons spent in silent rooms, or the weight of expectation that rested on each new generation. The people who lived these lives are known only by their titles and their relationships, daughter of the king, wife of the ruler, mother of the heir. Their names are listed in inscriptions, but their voices are gone. Even when illness came, or when a child died young, there was little written about it. These events were recorded in passing, with the same tone as a note about the level of the Nile or the number of oxen in the royal herd. There was no mourning in the texts, no expression of grief. The loss was absorbed into the routine, like a small stone dropped into still water. The family continued, the rituals continued, the days passed one after another without disruption. The idea of personal emotion was not absent, but it was not something that belonged in the official record. Over time, the practice of internal marriage became so common that it was no longer questioned. It was simply part of the structure of royal life, like the walls of the palace or the path to the temple. It did not bring happiness, nor was it meant to. It was meant to preserve order, to maintain the appearance of divine continuity, and to prevent change. And in that, it was successful, at least for a time. The throne passed from one generation to the next, each ruler connected to the last by blood and ritual, each marriage a quiet repetition of the one before. By the time the centuries began to turn toward the year 200 before the Common Era, the tradition was still in place, though the world around it was changing. New powers were rising, new ideas were spreading, and the old ways were beginning to feel heavier, harder to carry. But still, the marriages continued. Still, the same steps were followed. Still, the same words were spoken in the same quiet rooms. There was no rush to end the practice, no sudden realization that it might not be necessary. It simply went on, as quietly and steadily as the flow of sand in an hourglass, marking time without making a sound. The women who lived in the royal courts during the centuries between 700 and 200 before the Common Era did not speak often in public, nor were their words recorded in the same way as those of men. Their presence was noted, their names sometimes written in stone or on papyrus, but their thoughts were not preserved. They moved through the halls of the palace in quiet steps, wearing long robes that brushed the floor, their hair covered or braided in the same style for years at a time. They did not lead armies, issue decrees, or attend the meetings where decisions about grain, taxes, or borders were made. Their role was not one of action, but of position. They were part of the structure of the court, like columns in a temple or rows of trees along a canal, steady and expected. When a woman became a queen through marriage to a pharaoh, her life changed in form, but not always in substance. She was given new titles, new rooms, and new duties, but the rhythm of her days remained much the same. She rose at dawn, performed her ablutions in silence, and dressed in garments that had been prepared the night before. Her meals were brought to her at fixed times, always the same food served on the same plates. She walked the same paths through the palace each day, passing the same statues, the same painted walls, the same guards who stood without speaking. There was little variation in her schedule, and that was considered a sign of order, not boredom. Her main responsibilities involved religious offerings and appearances at ceremonies. She would stand beside the pharaoh during rituals at the temple, holding a small jar of oil or a bouquet of flowers, neither of which she would use. Her presence was symbolic, meant to show that the royal family was complete, that the divine order was being followed. She did not speak during these events, nor did she perform any actions beyond what had been practiced in advance. A priest would guide her steps if she needed to move, but usually she only stood still, looking forward, her hands resting at her sides. The people who watched from a distance saw her as part of the scene, not as a person with a separate will. Some queens were the mothers of future pharaohs, and in those cases, their status was slightly higher. They were referred to with honorifics, their names appeared more frequently in inscriptions, and they were sometimes allowed to oversee parts of the palace household. But even then, their authority was indirect. They did not give orders themselves, but rather approved requests that had already been reviewed by officials. They did not make laws or change traditions. Their influence, if it existed, was quiet and slow, felt more than seen, like a change in the temperature before a storm. It was never spoken of openly, and no records explain how or when a queen might have affected a decision. The marriages that brought these women into the royal family were not based on personal choice. A woman did not select her husband, nor was she asked for her opinion on the matter. The arrangement was made by elders, priests, and senior advisors who considered her lineage, her health, and her family's loyalty to the throne. Once the decision was made, it was final. There was no discussion, no delay, no opportunity to refuse. The marriage would take place on a date chosen by astrologers, at a time when the stars were in a favorable position, though the meaning of those positions was never explained to the woman involved. After the marriage, she would be taught the routines of court life by older women who had held the same role. These instructors spoke in low voices and repeated the same instructions many times. They taught her how to walk, how to stand, how to hold her hands, how to bow, how to remain silent during long ceremonies. She learned which rooms she could enter and which were forbidden, which topics were not to be discussed, and how to respond if someone addressed her directly. Most of her training involved doing nothing, standing still, waiting, listening without reacting. These were the skills that mattered most. There were no celebrations for her arrival, no songs sung in her honor, no public recognition of her individuality. She was not introduced as a person, but as a role, wife of the king, daughter of such and such a noble, bearer of the royal line. Her name was used in official records, but only in connection with the men in her life. She was the sister of a ruler, the mother of a prince, the daughter of a general. Her own identity was not the focus. Over time, she would begin to think of herself in the same way, not as someone with desires or dreams, but as a part of a system that had existed long before her and would continue long after. The children she bore were raised by nurses and tutors, not by her. She might see them each day for a short time, usually in the morning, when they would stand before her and recite a verse or show a drawing they had made. She would nod, say a few quiet words, and then they would be taken away. There was no playing on the floor, no holding, no laughing together. These things were not forbidden, but they were not part of the routine. The children belonged to the state, not to her, and their upbringing was designed to prepare them for duty, not for affection. Some queens lived for many years without ever leaving the palace grounds. Their world was bounded by stone walls and guarded gates. They saw the same faces every day, servants, priests, officials, none of whom spoke to them unless spoken to. They had no friends, no confidants, no companions of equal status. Other women in the court were either servants or distant relatives, none of whom could share their position. Loneliness was not named, but it was present, like dust on a shelf, unnoticed but always there. When a pharaoh died, his wife did not remarry immediately, if at all. She might take on the title of Queen Mother if her son became ruler, or she might retire to a quieter part of the palace, where her duties were reduced to occasional appearances and silent prayers. Her influence, if any, would be at its highest during the early years of a new reign, when traditions were being re-established and advisors were being chosen. But even then, her role was behind the scenes, expressed through small gestures, a look, a pause in conversation. She did not sign documents or attend council meetings. Her presence was felt in the way decisions were framed, not in the decisions themselves. The inscriptions that mention these women are brief and formal. They list their names, their titles, and the names of the rulers they were connected to. They do not describe their appearance, their personality, or their thoughts. There are no stories of private moments, no records of what they said in private rooms. The carvings on temple walls show them standing behind the pharaoh, slightly smaller, slightly to the side, their hands folded in front of them. They are always dressed the same way, always in the same pose, as if they were part of the background rather than the main event. Over the centuries, generation after generation of royal women lived this way. Their lives were long, quiet, and uneventful. They did not seek change, nor were they expected to. They were part of a system that valued stability above all else. Their marriages were not about love or partnership, but about continuity. Their children were not raised for happiness, but for duty. Their presence at ceremonies was not to honor them, but to complete the image of order that the state wished to project. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the role of royal women had not changed in any noticeable way. The same routines were followed, the same silences observed, the same paths walked. The world outside was shifting, new rulers came from distant lands, new languages were spoken in the streets, new gods were being honored, but within the palace, little was different. The women still stood in the same places, wore the same clothes, and played the same quiet roles. They were not forgotten, exactly, but they were not remembered either. They existed in the space between events, in the silence between words, in the long, slow passage of time that marked the end of an era. When the rulers from the north began to take control of Egypt, the changes that followed were not sudden or dramatic. They came slowly, like the gradual shift in temperature at the start of a new season. The men who came from the land of the Greeks did not destroy the old temples or erase the names of the gods. They did not ban the priests or stop the rituals that had been performed for centuries. Instead, they allowed these things to continue, while quietly placing themselves at the center of power. They spoke a different language, wore different clothes, and followed different customs in private, but in public, they behaved as pharaohs always had. They stood in the same poses in carvings, made offerings at the same altars, and claimed the same divine status as those who came before them. The people saw little reason to resist, because very little seemed to change. The arrival of the Greek rulers did not bring loud celebrations or open conflict. It was not marked by fire or music, but by paperwork, quiet meetings, and small adjustments to the way things were done. Officials continued to collect grain, record harvests, and manage the canals. Priests still performed their duties at sunrise. The sun still rose over the desert, the Nile still flooded in its time, and the stars still moved across the sky in the same patterns. Life for most people went on as it always had. The difference was in the names at the top of the lists, in the way orders were now written in 2 languages, and in the slow appearance of new faces in the palace. One of the first changes, though it was not noticed at first, was in the way marriages were arranged. The new rulers, who called themselves kings but were also called pharaohs, did not always marry women from distant lands or from Egyptian noble families. Instead, they often chose women from their own circle, from among those who had come with them from the north. These women spoke Greek, wore different styles of clothing, and followed customs that were unfamiliar to the people of Egypt. But they were given the title of queen, appeared in official ceremonies, and were shown in carvings standing beside the king, just as the old queens had been. The ceremonies for these marriages were longer than before and included words that few could understand. Priests from both traditions were present, one reciting in Egyptian, the other in Greek, their voices overlapping in a way that made the meaning unclear. There were more objects involved: crowns, scrolls, small statues, placed on tables covered with cloth of a deep purple color. The bride wore a veil that covered her face until a certain moment in the ritual, when it was lifted by a child chosen for the occasion. These details were new, but they were not rejected. They were absorbed into the existing order, like a small stone added to a wall that had stood for centuries. Over time, the presence of Greek customs became more common, but never overwhelming. The rulers did not force their ways on the people. They built temples in the old style, supported the priesthood, and followed the rituals connected to the flooding of the Nile. At the same time, they also built gymnasiums where young men could exercise, established schools where Greek was taught, and held quiet gatherings where philosophy was discussed in low voices. These activities took place in separate spaces, away from the temples and the markets, and most people did not attend them. They were for the ruling class, for those who served in the palace, for the soldiers and scribes who had come from distant lands. The queens of this period lived in a space between two worlds. They were expected to appear Egyptian in public, to wear the traditional headdresses, to stand beside the king in the correct position during ceremonies, and to make offerings to the old gods. But in private, they followed Greek customs, spoke their native language, and raised their children with different habits. Their rooms in the palace were furnished differently, with chairs instead of floor cushions, tables with writing materials, and mirrors made of polished metal. They read scrolls that told stories of distant heroes, listened to music played on stringed instruments, and sometimes wrote letters to family members who lived far away. The children born from these marriages were given names that combined both traditions. They had Greek first names and Egyptian titles. They were taught to speak both languages, though they often spoke Greek more easily. Their education was long and slow, filled with repetition and memorization. They learned about the gods of Egypt, the rituals of the temple, the history of the pharaohs, but they also studied Greek poetry, the movements of the stars, and the rules of debate. Their tutors were careful not to favor one tradition over the other, but to present both as equally important, even when they clearly were not. The king himself lived a divided life. In public, he was a pharaoh, dressed in linen robes, wearing the double crown, performing rituals with solemn silence. In private, he might wear a simple tunic, walk through gardens designed in the Greek style, and discuss matters of state in a language that most of his people did not understand. He attended both temple festivals and quiet dinners with foreign advisors. He made offerings to Amun and also honored Zeus in a smaller shrine within the palace grounds. These acts were not seen as contradictory, but as necessary. He was not just a ruler of Egypt, but a link between two worlds, and his marriage was part of that balance. The marriages of this time were not passionate or romantic. They were not celebrated with dancing or loud music. They were formal events, held in the early afternoon, attended by officials, priests, and a small number of guests. There was no feast, no wine poured freely, no singing that lasted into the night. The couple would stand before a table with offerings, repeat words that had been written down for them, and then walk a short path to a room where they would be left alone for a short time. After that, they would return to their duties as if nothing had changed. The people who lived in the cities and villages did not speak much about these marriages. They had little information about them, and even less reason to care. The price of bread, the level of the river, the arrival of tax collectors, these were the things that affected their lives. The marriage of a king to a foreign woman was a matter for the palace, not for the streets. It was recorded in official documents, mentioned in temple inscriptions, but not discussed in homes or markets. It was simply another fact, like the name of the current ruler or the year in the cycle of the flood. As the years passed, the presence of Greek influence became more visible, but never dominant. The old ways continued in the temples and in the fields. The new ways existed in the palace, in the administrative offices, in the homes of those who served the king. The two systems ran alongside each other, like two canals that never quite meet. The marriages of the rulers reflected this separation. They were unions between individuals, but also between traditions, each side keeping its own customs, its own language, its own understanding of the world. There was no effort to blend the two completely. No attempt was made to create a single, unified culture. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance of difference, as long as order was maintained and the flow of grain and taxes continued uninterrupted. The king married a Greek woman, but she played the role of an Egyptian queen. The priests kept their power, but reported to officials who spoke a different language. The people went to the temples, celebrated the old festivals, and lived their lives as they always had. By the time the years approached 500 before the Common Era, the pattern was well established. The rulers were Greek in origin, but Egyptian in appearance. Their marriages followed a mixed form, neither fully one thing nor the other. The women who became queens did not change the system, nor were they expected to. They fulfilled their roles, stood in the right places, and bore children who would continue the line. The future was not discussed, the past was not questioned, and the present moved forward at a steady, unchanging pace. The rulers who came after the first of the Ptolemies followed a pattern that had been set long before any of them were born. It was not a rule written in stone, nor was it ever formally declared in a public decree. It was simply understood, passed down from one generation to the next through quiet example and unspoken agreement. A king would marry a woman from his own family, usually a sister or a close female relative, and this union would be accepted without question. The reason for this practice was not often discussed, but when it was mentioned, it was said to preserve the purity of the royal blood and to prevent power from passing into the hands of outsiders. There was no debate about whether this was right or natural. It was simply the way things were done, like the rising of the sun or the annual flood of the Nile. Each new ruler, when he reached the proper age, would be married to a woman who shared his name and his ancestry. The ceremony was always held in the palace, never in a public temple, and it followed the same order of events each time. A priest would stand before the couple, dressed in plain linen, and speak in a low, steady voice. The words he used were the same ones that had been spoken at previous ceremonies, repeated across decades with only slight variations in tone. The bride would wear a white robe with a golden border, and the groom would wear the ceremonial collar of office. They would stand side by side, facing forward, their hands resting at their sides. There would be no exchange of personal vows, no touching, no eye contact. The entire event lasted less than an hour and was attended by a small group of officials, priests, and distant relatives who remained silent throughout. After the marriage, the queen would take on the duties that had been assigned to queens before her. She would appear at religious festivals, stand beside the king during temple offerings, and be shown in carvings on the walls of new buildings. Her image would be smaller than the king's, placed slightly behind him, as was proper. She would make appearances at certain rituals, holding a lotus flower or a small jar of oil, though she never actually used these objects. Her presence was symbolic, meant to show that the royal line was intact and that tradition was being followed. She did not speak during these events, nor was she expected to. Her role was to be seen, not heard. The couple did not live together in the way that ordinary people might. They had separate rooms in the palace, different schedules, and little time spent in each other's company. Their interactions were limited to official functions and brief meetings with advisors. There was no record of private conversations between them, no letters, no personal reflections. The idea of affection or companionship was not part of the arrangement. The purpose of the marriage was not personal happiness, but continuity. The hope, always present but never spoken aloud, was that a child would be born, preferably a son, who could one day inherit the throne and continue the line. The children who were born from these unions were raised in a quiet, controlled environment. They did not play with other children or leave the inner rooms of the palace except for ceremonial occasions. Their days were filled with lessons in reading, writing, and religious practice, all taught by elderly tutors who spoke slowly and repeated the same information many times. They learned about the gods of Egypt, the rituals of the temple, and the history of the kings, but they also studied Greek language and the movements of the stars. Their education was long and without variation, designed to prepare them for duty, not for joy. As each new ruler came to power, the same pattern repeated itself. He would marry a sister or a close female relative, the ceremony would be held in the same room, the same words would be spoken, the same robes worn. There was no effort to make the event different or more meaningful. It was not celebrated with feasting or music. There were no public announcements beyond the official record, no songs composed in honor of the bride, no gifts exchanged beyond the ceremonial objects used in the ritual. The marriage was not a beginning, but a continuation, a quiet step in a process that had no end in sight. The queens who entered these marriages did so without protest. They had been raised knowing that this was their role, that their life would follow a certain path, and that personal choice had little place in it. They accepted their duties without complaint, performed their rituals with calm precision, and appeared in the correct places at the correct times. They did not seek influence, nor were they given the means to exert it. Any effect they may have had on decisions was indirect, felt in small ways, through a pause in conversation, a glance, a suggestion made to a servant who then passed it to an official. These moments were not recorded, and their significance, if any, was never confirmed. Over time, the names of the rulers and queens became repetitive. The same first names appeared again and again: Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Arsinoe, Berenice, passed from one generation to the next like heirlooms. A man named Ptolemy would marry a woman named Cleopatra, and their son would be named Ptolemy, and when he grew up, he would marry another Cleopatra, and so on. The names were not tied to individual people, but to roles. Each new Ptolemy was expected to behave like the ones before him, to follow the same customs, to marry in the same way, to rule with the same quiet authority. There was no expectation of change, no desire for innovation. The temples built during this time showed images of the royal family standing in straight lines, each figure slightly smaller than the one before. The king stood at the front, the queen behind, the children arranged to the side. Their faces were calm, their hands held in the same position, their clothing identical in style. These carvings were made with great care, but they did not capture any sense of personality. No one smiled. No one looked to the side. They all faced forward, as if looking into a distant future they would never see. The inscriptions beneath them listed their names and titles, but nothing more. There were no descriptions of their thoughts, their feelings, or their private lives. When a ruler died, his wife did not remarry, at least not in any official way. She might take on the title of Queen Mother if her son became king, or she might retire to a quieter part of the palace, where her duties were reduced to occasional appearances and silent prayers. Her influence, if any, faded gradually, like the light at the end of the day. She would continue to be mentioned in temple records, her name included in offerings, but her presence in court life would diminish. She would walk the same halls, see the same walls, and follow the same routine until the end of her days. The practice of marrying within the family continued for many generations. It did not bring stability, nor did it prevent conflict. Brothers still fought brothers. Advisors still plotted. Power still shifted in quiet, unseen ways. But the marriages themselves remained unchanged. They were not meant to solve problems, but to maintain the appearance of order. As long as the rituals were followed, the correct people stood in the correct places, and the same names were passed down, the system could continue. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the tradition was still in place. The same rooms were used for ceremonies. The same words were spoken. The same robes were worn. There was no sign that this would ever change. The world outside was shifting, new powers were rising, new ideas were spreading, but within the palace, time moved slowly, if at all. The marriages of the Ptolemies were not events. They were repetitions. They were not beginnings. They were simply part of the long, quiet passage of years that marked the end of an age. The ceremonies that marked the union of a pharaoh and his chosen wife were not celebrations in the way that people today might understand the word. There was no music played for enjoyment, no dancing, no laughter or loud voices. The events were not held for the purpose of joy, but for the purpose of order. They were part of a long tradition of rituals meant to show that the king was following the proper path, that he was acting in harmony with the gods, and that the balance of the world was being maintained. The marriage was not a personal event, but a public act with religious meaning, carried out in the same way each time, with little variation from one century to the next. The ceremonies took place in a room within the palace that had been used for such purposes for many generations. It was not large, nor was it decorated with bright colors or gold. The walls were painted in soft tones, the floor was made of smooth stone, and the air was kept cool by the thickness of the walls. A small altar stood at one end of the room, made of dark wood and covered with a white cloth. On the cloth were placed a few simple objects, a lotus flower, a small jar of oil, a piece of linen, and a clay seal. These items were not chosen for their beauty, but because they had been used before, and their presence was required by custom. No one explained their meaning in detail, but everyone understood that they belonged there. The priest who led the ceremony arrived early in the morning, dressed in plain white linen with no ornaments or jewelry. He did not speak to anyone as he entered, but walked slowly to the altar, placed his hands on it for a moment, and then turned to face the door. He waited in silence until the couple arrived, accompanied by 2 attendants who did not enter the room. The pharaoh and his bride would stand before the altar, side by side, their eyes forward, their hands at their sides. They did not look at each other. They did not speak. There was no sign of emotion on their faces. They stood as they had been instructed, in the correct position, at the correct distance from the altar. The priest began to speak in a low, steady voice. The words were in Egyptian, though sometimes a phrase in Greek was added, spoken quietly and without emphasis. The text had been used for many years, passed down from one priest to the next, copied onto papyrus and memorized by heart. It spoke of balance, of duty, of the connection between the king and the gods, and of the need for continuity in the royal line. It did not mention love, happiness, or personal choice. It did not describe the future or make promises. It was not a vow, but a statement of fact, like a record of grain stored in a warehouse or the height of the Nile at flood season. As the priest spoke, he performed a series of small actions. He lifted the lotus flower and placed it on the left side of the altar. He opened the jar of oil and poured a single drop onto the linen. He pressed the clay seal into the palm of the pharaoh's hand and then closed the king's fingers around it. Each movement was slow and deliberate, done in the same way every time. There was no variation in the order, no improvisation, no attempt to make the moment feel special. The actions were not meant to be meaningful in themselves, but to fulfill a requirement, to complete a sequence that had to be followed exactly. The couple did not respond during the ceremony. They did not repeat any words, make any gestures, or take any active part. They were present, but passive, like statues placed in a temple courtyard. The priest did not ask for their agreement, nor did he look at them as he spoke. His eyes remained on the altar, his voice steady and even. The entire event lasted about 40 minutes, though it felt longer due to the lack of movement and sound. When the priest finished speaking, he stepped back, placed his hands at his sides, and bowed his head. The couple then turned and left the room in silence, followed by the attendants. The objects on the altar were left in place until the next morning, when they were removed and replaced with new ones of the same kind. After the ceremony, there was no gathering, no meal, no exchange of gifts. The queen returned to her rooms and resumed her usual routine. The pharaoh attended a meeting with advisors or inspected a construction project, as he would have done on any other day. The marriage was not discussed in the days that followed, except in official records. A scribe would write a short note stating that the event had taken place, listing the names of the couple, the date, and the name of the priest. This note would be stored in the palace archives, copied onto a stone tablet, and sometimes mentioned in temple inscriptions. The language was always formal and brief, with no additional details. The religious significance of the ceremony was never explained in full. It was understood that the king was a divine figure, connected to the gods, and that his marriage was part of his sacred duty. By taking a wife, especially one from his own family, he was preserving the purity of the royal bloodline and maintaining the balance between the human and divine worlds. The presence of the priest, the use of sacred objects, and the recitation of traditional words were all meant to align the event with the will of the gods. But these ideas were not discussed openly. They were simply accepted, like the rising of the sun or the flow of the river. Temples across the country sometimes held quiet observances on the day of a royal marriage, though these were not public festivals. A small offering would be made at dawn, a hymn would be sung in a low voice, and a lamp would be lit in the inner chamber. These acts were performed by a single priest or a small group of temple servants. No one from the general population was invited to attend. The events were not announced in advance, nor were they remembered afterward. They were part of the routine maintenance of the divine order, like cleaning the altar or refilling the oil in the lamps. The queen, after the ceremony, was expected to participate in religious duties more frequently. She would make offerings at the temple twice a month, stand beside the pharaoh during certain rituals, and appear in carvings that showed her presenting gifts to the gods. Her role was symbolic, but necessary. She represented the female aspect of the divine balance, the counterpart to the king's authority. She did not speak during these events, nor did she perform any actions beyond what had been practiced in advance. A senior priest would guide her steps if needed, but usually she only stood still, looking forward, her hands resting at her sides. Over time, the ceremonies changed very little. Even as new rulers came from distant lands, even as the language of the court slowly shifted, the form of the marriage ritual remained the same. The same objects were used, the same words spoken, the same movements performed. There was no effort to modernize or simplify the process. It was not meant to be efficient, but to be correct. The idea was that as long as the ritual was carried out exactly as it had been done before, the world would remain in balance, the gods would be satisfied, and the reign would continue without disruption. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the ceremonies were still held in the same room, with the same objects, and the same quiet dignity. The priest still spoke in a low voice. The couple still stood without moving. The altar still held the lotus, the oil, the linen, and the seal. Nothing about the event suggested that it was special or rare. It was simply another act in a long series of acts, repeated across centuries, each one blending into the next, like waves on a calm sea. The marriage was not a beginning. It was a continuation. And the ritual was not a performance. It was a habit, deeply settled, quietly observed, and never questioned. The practice of forming alliances through marriage with rulers from distant lands was not uncommon during the centuries between 700 and 200 before the Common Era, though it did not happen with great frequency. These unions were not the result of personal connections or emotional bonds, but of careful discussions held in quiet rooms over long periods of time. Officials from both sides would exchange messages, review the lineage of the proposed bride or groom, and consider the possible effects such a marriage might have on trade, borders, and military relations. The process was slow and required many steps, each one recorded in official documents that were copied and stored in dry rooms within the palace. There was no rush, no excitement, and very little public knowledge about the arrangements being made. When a decision was finally reached, it was treated as a matter of routine, not celebration. The marriage was seen as a formal agreement, similar to a treaty or a trade agreement, but expressed through the union of two individuals rather than written terms. The woman who was to be married to a foreign ruler was usually chosen from among the daughters or sisters of the current king, not because of her personality or abilities, but because her position made the alliance meaningful. She was prepared for her role over many months, taught the language of the country she would move to, instructed in the customs of the court, and shown how to behave during ceremonies. Her education was calm and repetitive, focused on obedience, silence, and correct appearance. The journey to the foreign land was long and uneventful. She traveled by boat along the river or by carriage across dry ground, accompanied by a small group of servants, priests, and guards. The route was planned in advance, with stops at designated points where food and shelter were provided. There were no delays, no unplanned events, and no opportunities for conversation with people outside the group. She remained inside the carriage or cabin during most of the trip, only stepping out at night to rest in rooms that had been prepared ahead of time. The people in the villages she passed through were not told who she was or why she was traveling. They saw only a covered vehicle, a line of quiet figures, and then silence once more. Upon arrival, there was no public welcome or festival. The foreign ruler would meet her at the edge of the city or at the palace gate, accompanied by a small group of officials. The greeting was brief and formal. No embraces, no words of affection, no speeches. She was led inside, shown to her rooms, and left to rest. The marriage ceremony took place a few days later, following the customs of the host country, though with small adjustments to include elements from her own tradition. A priest from each side would speak a few lines, objects of symbolic value would be placed on a table, and the couple would stand side by side, facing forward. The entire event lasted less than an hour and was attended by no more than 20 people. Life after the marriage followed a predictable pattern. The queen would take on the duties expected of her in the new court, appearing at ceremonies, making offerings at temples, and being present during official meals. She did not participate in decision-making or attend meetings of advisors. Her role was to represent the alliance, to be seen as part of the royal family, and to produce children if possible. Her daily routine was highly structured, with little variation from one day to the next. She rose at the same time each morning, ate the same meals, walked the same paths through the palace, and spoke only when spoken to. Her attendants were chosen by the court, not by her, and they reported on her behavior regularly. Communication with her homeland was limited and slow. Messages were sent on papyrus scrolls, sealed with wax, and carried by trusted messengers who took weeks to complete the journey. The replies, when they came, were brief and formal, containing no personal reflections or emotional expressions. They spoke of health, weather, and the status of certain rituals, nothing more. There was no mention of longing, loneliness, or difficulty adjusting. These feelings, if they existed, were not recorded. The official correspondence maintained the appearance of order and calm, as if everything was proceeding as expected. The political effects of these marriages were rarely immediate or noticeable. Alliances formed through marriage did not always lead to peace or cooperation. Trade agreements still had to be negotiated separately. Borders were still disputed. Armies still moved when conflicts arose. The presence of a foreign queen in the palace did not prevent war, nor did it guarantee loyalty between nations. The marriage was a symbol, not a solution. It showed that two rulers had agreed to a connection, but it did not enforce that agreement. Over time, some of these unions were quietly forgotten, the queen fading into the background, her name no longer mentioned in official records. The children born from these marriages were raised in the court of the foreign ruler, taught in the language of that land, and prepared for roles within its system. They were not raised as Egyptians, even if their mother was. Their education focused on the history, religion, and customs of the country they lived in. They learned little about Egypt, except as a distant place of origin. Their names were often local, adapted to the speech of the region. They did not visit their mother's homeland, and few ever saw it in person. Their identity was shaped by their environment, not by bloodline. Back in Egypt, the marriage was recorded in the palace archives, noted in temple inscriptions, and sometimes mentioned in religious offerings. The queen's name would appear in a list of royal women, followed by the name of the foreign ruler and the date of the union. The entry was brief, written in a steady hand, with no additional comments. There were no stories told about her life abroad, no accounts of her experiences, no reflections on the success or failure of the alliance. The fact of the marriage was enough. Its meaning, if any, was left unspoken. These diplomatic unions became less common as time passed. The rulers of Egypt found other ways to manage relations with distant powers, relying more on written agreements, trade, and military presence than on marriage. The idea of sending a royal woman to live in a foreign court became less appealing, especially as the balance of power shifted and Egypt's influence declined. The risks outweighed the benefits, and the effort required was no longer seen as worthwhile. The practice did not end suddenly, but faded gradually, like a path worn down by lack of use. When such marriages did occur in the later years, they followed the same format as before. The preparations were the same, the journey was the same, the ceremony was the same. Nothing was added, nothing was changed. The queen still traveled in silence, still stood beside a man she barely knew, still lived a life of quiet routine in a place that was not her home. There was no attempt to make the process more comfortable or meaningful. It was still treated as a duty, not a choice, and carried out with the same calm detachment that had marked earlier unions. By the time the years approached 200 before the Common Era, the idea of a royal marriage as a tool of diplomacy had lost much of its importance. The world was changing, new powers were rising, and old methods were no longer effective. The palaces of distant lands were filled with rulers who did not follow the same traditions, who did not see marriage as a sacred duty or a symbol of divine balance. Alliances were made and broken with little ceremony. The long journeys, the quiet ceremonies, the years of silence, none of it mattered as much as it once had. And so, the practice continued only in memory, in the inscriptions on stone, in the scrolls stored in dark rooms, in the names listed among the royal women who had left their homeland and disappeared into the silence of foreign courts. Their lives were not celebrated, not mourned, not remembered in stories. They existed in records, in positions, in roles. They were part of a system that valued stability over change, silence over speech, repetition over novelty. And when the last of these marriages took place, it did so without notice, without fanfare, without anyone remarking that it might be the final one. It was simply another event, recorded, completed, and filed away. The years that passed between 300 and 200 before the Common Era did not bring sudden changes to the royal court, but rather a slow and quiet fading of the old ways. There were no loud declarations, no ceremonies to mark the end of an era, no speeches about what had been lost. Instead, the traditions that had defined the lives of pharaohs for centuries began to lose their meaning, not with a collapse, but with a gradual silence. The marriages that once carried religious significance, political weight, and dynastic purpose became less frequent, less formal, and eventually less necessary. No one decided to end the practice. It simply stopped being repeated, like a path through sand that disappears when no one walks on it. The rulers of Egypt during this time still held the title of king or queen, still wore the symbols of office, and still appeared in carvings on temple walls. But their power was not what it had once been. Decisions that had once been made in the palace were now influenced, and sometimes made, by officials from a distant land called Rome. These men did not live in Egypt, but their letters arrived regularly, written on thin sheets of parchment and sealed with red wax. The replies were carefully worded, copied by scribes, and sent back with the same quiet urgency. The pharaohs still performed rituals, made offerings, and married according to custom, but the weight of these acts grew lighter with each passing year. They were done because they had always been done, not because they mattered. The marriages themselves became smaller, simpler, and less documented. There were fewer ceremonies held in the traditional room, fewer priests present, fewer objects placed on the altar. The lotus flower was sometimes missing. The jar of oil was not always opened. The clay seal was no longer pressed into the king's hand. The words spoken by the priest were shortened, spoken in a lower voice, as if even he no longer believed they needed to be heard. The queen still stood beside the ruler, still wore the white robe, still followed the same path through the palace, but her presence was no longer seen as essential. She was not mentioned as often in inscriptions, not shown as clearly in carvings, not listed in as many records. Some rulers chose not to marry at all. There was no rule requiring it, no law stating that a king must have a wife. The idea of producing an heir remained, but the method of securing the succession changed. A son might be named as successor without the mother being elevated to the status of queen. A nephew or cousin might be chosen, trained in the palace, and presented to the court without any ceremonial union taking place. The connection between marriage and power, once strong and unquestioned, began to weaken. The royal bloodline, once so carefully preserved through internal marriages, was no longer seen as the only source of legitimacy. Women who had once been brought into the royal family through marriage or birth found their roles reduced. The title of Queen Mother, once a position of quiet influence, became ceremonial, then disappeared from use. The rooms in the palace that had belonged to queens were left empty, their doors closed, their furnishings covered in cloth. The servants who had attended them were reassigned to other duties. The offerings made in their names at temples became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Their names were still written in some records, but without the honorifics, without the titles, as if they were no longer part of the sacred order. The temples, once filled with activity during royal events, became quieter. The priests still performed their daily rituals, still lit the lamps, still recited the old words, but with less frequency and less expectation that the gods were listening. The carvings on the walls continued to show images of kings and queens standing together, but these images were no longer updated. The last known depiction of a royal marriage was made in a small temple near the Delta, and even there, the figures were smaller than before, the lines less detailed, the paint applied unevenly. It was as if the artists no longer believed in the importance of what they were showing. In the cities and villages, people paid little attention to the changes at the top. Their lives were shaped by the price of grain, the level of the Nile, the arrival of tax collectors. The marriage of a king was not a matter that affected their daily routine. They did not gather in the streets when a new queen was named, nor did they stop working when a ceremony was held. The idea of the pharaoh as a living god still existed, but it was spoken of less often, and with less conviction. The stories of the old gods, once told by elders in the evenings, were repeated less frequently. New ideas, new languages, new customs arrived with traders, soldiers, and travelers from the north. The world was becoming larger, and Egypt's place in it was becoming smaller. The final rulers of the Ptolemaic line continued some of the old practices, but without the same sense of purpose. One queen, known by the name Cleopatra, married two of her brothers and later formed a connection with a ruler from Rome. This union was not a marriage in the traditional sense, nor was it carried out according to Egyptian custom. It was not blessed by priests, not recorded in temple inscriptions, not followed by the usual rituals. It existed in letters, in political agreements, in the movements of armies. When she died, there was no ceremony to mark the end of her reign, no formal transfer of power, no new king declared in the old way. The palace was occupied by Roman officials. The titles were no longer used. The line of pharaohs, unbroken for more than 3,000 years, simply ended. After that, the rooms where marriages had once been held remained unused. The altar was removed. The white robes were stored in wooden chests and forgotten. The scribes stopped writing the names of queens in the official lists. The carvings on the temple walls were left as they were, slowly worn down by wind and sand. No one tried to restore them. No one explained them to the younger generations. They became part of the landscape, like old trees or dry canals, present but not noticed. The idea of marrying within the family, of preserving royal blood, of aligning the king with the gods through ritual, all of it faded into silence. It was not rejected, not forgotten, not replaced. It was simply no longer repeated. The reasons for the marriages, political stability, religious duty, dynastic continuity, are no longer applied in the same way. The world had changed, slowly and without announcement, and the old system could not adapt. It did not break. It stopped. By the year 200 before the Common Era, the practice of royal marriage among the pharaohs had already lost its meaning. The last ceremonies had been performed without belief. The last queens had lived their lives in quiet obscurity. The last kings had ruled without full authority. And when the final records were made, they were written in a different language, stored in a different place, and used for different purposes. The long line of unions, stretching back through centuries, ended not with a cry, but with a breath, soft and unnoticed, like the closing of a door in an empty house.
The arrival of the disease. The disease came to Europe in a way that was not expected. It moved slowly at first, spreading from one place to another without much notice. People did not understand where it had come from or how it could be stopped. The illness was called smallpox, and it made people sick in a way that was hard to forget. It started with a fever and then a rash that covered the body. The skin became red and painful, and the person could not move easily. Some people died because their bodies could not fight the sickness. Others lived but were left with scars that never went away. Many people thought the disease was punishment from the gods. They prayed for help and tried to find ways to stay safe. Some believed that if they avoided certain places or people, they would not get sick. Others tried to use herbs and mixtures that were said to protect against the illness. But none of these methods worked well. The disease continued to spread through villages and cities, taking more lives each day. There were no doctors who knew how to cure the illness. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and people did not have the tools to understand what was happening. They watched as friends and family fell ill and could do little to stop it. The fear of the disease grew, and people began to avoid others, not knowing who might be carrying it. This made it harder to treat those who were sick and caused more suffering. There were no clear signs that the disease would end soon. It moved quietly through the land, appearing in one town after another, always finding new people to make sick. Some families lost several members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and quiet streets. Others lost only one or two, but that was still enough to change the way they lived. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. They looked around them and saw the effects of the disease everywhere: children crying, adults struggling to walk, and the silence of those who had passed away. The disease changed the way people lived. They built walls around their homes, kept their distance from strangers, and tried to keep their houses clean. But even with these efforts, the illness found a way in. It was a constant presence, always waiting for the next person to fall. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. The arrival of the disease marked a difficult time in history. It brought pain and loss, but also lessons that would shape the future. People learned that some things could not be controlled, and that sometimes the best they could do was survive. The struggle against the disease was just beginning, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. The disease came to Europe in a way that was not expected. It moved slowly at first, spreading from one place to another without much notice. People did not understand where it had come from or how it could be stopped. The illness was called smallpox, and it made people sick in a way that was hard to forget. It started with a fever and then a rash that covered the body. The skin became red and painful, and the person could not move easily. Some people died because their bodies could not fight the sickness. Others lived but were left with scars that never went away. Many people thought the disease was punishment from the gods. They prayed for help and tried to find ways to stay safe. Some believed that if they avoided certain places or people, they would not get sick. Others tried to use herbs and mixtures that were said to protect against the illness. But none of these methods worked well. The disease continued to spread through villages and cities, taking more lives each day. There were no doctors who knew how to cure the illness. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and people did not have the tools to understand what was happening. They watched as friends and family fell ill and could do little to stop it. The fear of the disease grew, and people began to avoid others, not knowing who might be carrying it. This made it harder to treat those who were sick and caused more suffering. There were no clear signs that the disease would end soon. It moved quietly through the land, appearing in one town after another, always finding new people to make sick. Some families lost several members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and quiet streets. Others lost only one or two, but that was still enough to change the way they lived. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. They looked around them and saw the effects of the disease everywhere: children crying, adults struggling to walk, and the silence of those who had passed away. The disease changed the way people lived. They built walls around their homes, kept their distance from strangers, and tried to keep their houses clean. But even with these efforts, the illness found a way in. It was a constant presence, always waiting for the next person to fall. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. The arrival of the disease marked a difficult time in history. It brought pain and loss, but also lessons that would shape the future. People learned that some things could not be controlled, and that sometimes the best they could do was survive. The struggle against the disease was just beginning, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. The disease came to Europe in a way that was not expected. It moved slowly at first, spreading from one place to another without much notice. People did not understand where it had come from or how it could be stopped. The illness was called smallpox, and it made people sick in a way that was hard to forget. It started with a fever and then a rash that covered the body. The skin became red and painful, and the person could not move easily. Some people died because their bodies could not fight the sickness. Others lived but were left with scars that never went away. Many people thought the disease was punishment from the gods. They prayed for help and tried to find ways to stay safe. Some believed that if they avoided certain places or people, they would not get sick. Others tried to use herbs and mixtures that were said to protect against the illness. But none of these methods worked well. The disease continued to spread through villages and cities, taking more lives each day. There were no doctors who knew how to cure the illness. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and people did not have the tools to understand what was happening. They watched as friends and family fell ill and could do little to stop it. The fear of the disease grew, and people began to avoid others, not knowing who might be carrying it. This made it harder to treat those who were sick and caused more suffering. There were no clear signs that the disease would end soon. It moved quietly through the land, appearing in one town after another, always finding new people to make sick. Some families lost several members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and quiet streets. Others lost only one or two, but that was still enough to change the way they lived. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. They looked around them and saw the effects of the disease everywhere, children crying, adults struggling to walk, and the silence of those who had passed away. The disease changed the way people lived. They built walls around their homes, kept their distance from strangers, and tried to keep their houses clean. But even with these efforts, the illness found a way in. It was a constant presence, always waiting for the next person to fall. The people of Europe faced this challenge with uncertainty and fear, not knowing when the sickness would end. The arrival of the disease marked a difficult time in history. It brought pain and loss, but also lessons that would shape the future. People learned that some things could not be controlled, and that sometimes the best they could do was survive. The struggle against the disease was just beginning, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. Beliefs and superstitions. People in Europe during this time had many ideas about why the disease was happening. Some thought it was a punishment from God, a sign that people had done something wrong and needed to change their ways. Others believed it was caused by bad air or evil spirits that moved through the land. These beliefs were common because there was no scientific way to explain what was happening. People did not know how the illness spread or what made it so deadly. They saw the suffering around them and tried to find reasons for it, even if those reasons were not based on facts or knowledge. In response to these fears, many people turned to religious practices. They prayed for protection and asked for forgiveness for their sins. Some went on pilgrimages to holy places, hoping that their journey would bring them safety. Others kept small icons or charms near their homes, believing they could ward off the sickness. These actions gave people a sense of control, even if they did not stop the disease from spreading. In a time of great uncertainty, having something to do, something to believe in, helped people feel less helpless. There were also many superstitions about how to avoid getting sick. Some people believed that certain foods or drinks could protect them. Others avoided going outside when the wind blew in a particular direction, thinking that the illness traveled with the air. Some thought that if they stayed inside all day, they would be safe. These ideas varied from place to place, but they all came from the same place: fear and a lack of understanding. People wanted to believe that there was something they could do to stay healthy, even if it was just a small gesture. many people tried to find signs that the disease would end. They watched the sky, looked at the stars, and listened to the animals. If the weather changed or if birds flew in a certain way, some believed it meant the illness was leaving. Others paid attention to the behavior of plants and trees, thinking that nature could give clues about what was happening. These beliefs were not based on facts, but they helped people feel like they were doing something to protect themselves. Even if the illness continued to spread, having something to look for gave people a sense of hope. Despite all these efforts, nothing really stopped the disease. It continued to move through the land, taking more lives each day. People who followed these beliefs often felt confused when the illness still came to them. This led to more fear and more questions about what was happening. Some people began to doubt their own beliefs, wondering if there was something else they could do to stay safe. The more they tried, the more they realized that their methods were not working, which only increased their frustration. The lack of clear answers made it hard for people to know what to believe. Some trusted the church more than ever, while others became skeptical of religious leaders. This created tension between different groups, as people argued over what the disease meant and how to respond. The uncertainty made life even harder for those who were already suffering. In a world where the cause of the illness was unknown, people struggled to find any kind of stability or direction. Even though these beliefs did not prevent the disease, they played an important role in how people coped with the situation. They provided comfort, a sense of purpose, and a way to make sense of something that seemed impossible to understand. People used these ideas to help them deal with the pain and loss around them, even if they did not always work. In times of great hardship, having something to believe in was often more important than having a solution. Over time, some of these beliefs began to fade as more people saw that they did not stop the illness. But for many, the fear remained strong, and the need for answers grew greater. The search for solutions continued, and new ideas began to take shape. The next step in the fight against the disease would come from different sources, but it would take time before people found a real way to stop it. The struggle was far from over, and the people of Europe would have to face many more challenges before they could begin to heal. The spread of the illness. The disease moved through Europe in a way that was difficult to control. It traveled from one village to another, often without warning. People did not know how it spread, so they could not stop it effectively. Some believed it passed through the air, others thought it came from water or food, and some blamed it on animals or strange creatures. Without clear information, people made guesses about what was happening, but none of these guesses led to real solutions. Every time someone got sick, it created more confusion and fear, as no one could say for sure why it was happening or how to prevent it. As the illness spread, more people became sick. Families lost members, and entire communities were affected. Some places had too many sick people to care for them all, so people had to leave their homes and go somewhere else. This movement helped the disease travel even further, as infected individuals carried it to new areas. The sickness did not follow any pattern, making it hard to predict where it would appear next. One day a town might be healthy, and the next day it could be filled with people who were weak and unable to move. This unpredictability made it even harder for people to prepare or protect themselves. In some places, the illness arrived suddenly and caused a lot of death in a short time. In other places, it spread slowly, giving people a little time to prepare. But no matter how fast or slow it came, it always found a way in. People watched as neighbors fell ill, and then they saw those same neighbors die. This created a deep sense of fear, and many people began to avoid each other, not knowing who might be carrying the disease. They stopped visiting each other, kept their distance, and tried to stay away from anyone who looked unwell. These actions were meant to protect them, but they also made life harder in many ways. The spread of the illness changed the way people lived. They stopped visiting each other as much, kept their doors closed, and avoided public gatherings. Children stayed inside more, and adults worked alone rather than in groups. These changes were meant to protect people, but they also made life harder. Without contact with others, people felt lonely and unsure of what to do. The disease was not just taking lives, it was changing the way people connected with one another. Relationships became strained, and trust was lost as people worried about being harmed by those around them. As the illness continued to move, more and more people became afraid. They did not know when it would come again or where it would go next. Some tried to leave their towns, hoping to find safety elsewhere, but this only helped the disease spread further. Travelers carried the illness to new places, and soon, even distant villages were affected. No one was safe, and no one knew how long the sickness would last. The fear was constant, and the uncertainty was overwhelming. People could not plan for the future, because they did not know if they would live to see it. The fear of the illness grew stronger as it spread. People looked around and saw signs of its presence everywhere: empty homes, quiet streets, and the sadness in people's eyes. They heard stories of families that had been completely wiped out, and they worried that the same thing could happen to them. This fear made people act in ways that were not always helpful. Some locked themselves inside, while others tried to hide the sick from others. These actions did not stop the disease, but they did create more suffering. People were afraid of each other, and that fear made everything worse. The illness did not care about who it affected. It took people of all ages, from young children to old men and women. Some families lost multiple members in a short time, leaving behind empty homes and broken hearts. Others lost only one person, but that loss was still enough to change their lives forever. The disease did not discriminate, and it did not stop for anyone. It simply moved forward, spreading wherever it could. It was relentless, and there was no way to escape it once it had taken hold. Even as the illness spread, people tried to find ways to protect themselves. They built walls around their homes, burned things they thought might carry the sickness, and avoided anything that seemed dangerous. But none of these efforts really worked. The disease found a way in no matter what people did. It was like trying to hold back the wind. No matter how hard you pushed, it always found a way through. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing stopped the illness from moving forward. The spread of the illness was a constant reminder of how powerless people felt. They could not stop it, they could not understand it, and they could not escape it. Every day brought new news of more people getting sick, and every night brought the fear of what might happen next. The disease was everywhere, and it was not going away anytime soon. The people of Europe had to face this reality, even though it was difficult to accept. They had to live with the knowledge that no one was safe, and that the sickness would continue until something changed. The lack of medical knowledge at the time when the illness spread across Europe, there was very little understanding about how diseases worked. Doctors did not know what caused sickness or how to treat it effectively. They could not see germs or bacteria, so they had no way to understand why people became ill. Instead, they made guesses based on what they saw and what they believed. Some thought the illness came from bad air, others thought it was caused by an imbalance in the body, and some blamed it on the stars or the weather. These ideas were not based on science, but they were the best explanations people had at the time. Without proper knowledge, people relied on their beliefs and traditions, even when those beliefs did not help them. Medical knowledge was limited, and most people did not have access to doctors. Those who did visit a physician often received treatments that did not help. Some doctors tried to bleed patients, believing that removing blood would make them feel better. Others used herbs and mixtures that were supposed to cure the illness, but these rarely worked. People followed these treatments because they had no other options, even though they knew they were not making things better. The lack of real medical knowledge meant that people had to rely on whatever advice they could get, even if it was wrong. This made it hard for anyone to recover, and many people died without ever knowing what was happening to them. There were no medicines that could stop the disease. No one had discovered vaccines or antibiotics, and no one knew how to fight the illness inside the body. People tried many different things to feel better, but none of them helped. Some took hot baths, thinking that heat would kill the sickness. Others drank strong liquids, hoping they would push out the illness. None of these methods worked, and many people continued to get worse. The lack of effective treatments made it hard for anyone to recover, and many people died without ever knowing what was happening to them. The suffering was constant, and the fear was growing with every passing day. Doctors and healers did not have the tools to study the disease properly. They could not look at the body and see what was wrong, so they had to guess. They watched people as they got sick and tried to find patterns, but they did not have enough information to understand the cause. This made it difficult to develop any kind of plan to stop the illness. Without clear answers, people could not know what to do, and this made the situation even harder to manage. The uncertainty added to the fear, and people felt more helpless than ever. The fear of the illness grew because people did not know how to protect themselves. They saw others getting sick and dying, but they could not find a way to prevent it. Some people tried to avoid going outside, thinking that staying inside would keep them safe. Others tried to stay away from people who looked unwell, hoping they would not catch the sickness. But none of these actions really stopped the illness from spreading. It moved through the land regardless of what people did, and this made them feel even more helpless. The more they tried, the more they realized that their efforts were not working, which only increased their frustration. Many people felt lost and confused. They did not know what was causing the illness or how to stop it. Some turned to religious leaders for guidance, hoping they would have answers. Others tried to find signs in nature, looking for clues that might explain what was happening. But no one had the right answers, and this uncertainty made life even harder. People lived with constant fear, not knowing when the next person would fall ill or when the sickness would end. Every day brought new worries, and every night brought the same heavy silence of loss and sorrow. The lack of medical knowledge also made it difficult for people to care for the sick. Without proper training or tools, those who tried to help often did not know what to do. They could not give the right medicine, they could not clean wounds properly, and they could not stop the pain. This made the suffering worse, and it added to the sense of helplessness that people already felt. The sick were left alone, and their families were forced to watch them die without being able to do anything to save them. The emotional weight of this was unbearable, and many people were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Even among those who tried to help, there was confusion about what to do. Some believed that certain foods or drinks could make the illness go away. Others thought that prayer or ritual could bring healing. But these ideas were not based on facts, and they did not work. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing changed the outcome. The illness continued to take lives, and the people of Europe had to live with the knowledge that they could not stop it. The struggle was long, and the hope was fading with each passing day. The lack of medical knowledge created a cycle of fear and frustration. People did not know how to protect themselves, they did not know how to treat the sick, and they did not know how to end the illness. This made every day a struggle, and it made the future seem uncertain. Without a clear path forward, people had to face the illness with nothing but hope and uncertainty. They could only wait and watch as the disease continued to move through their world, taking more lives each day. The past offered no solutions, and the future held no guarantees. All they could do was endure and try to survive. Social changes and isolation. As the illness continued to spread, people began to change the way they lived. They no longer visited each other as often as before. Families that once gathered together for meals or celebrations now kept their distance. People stopped going to markets, avoided public places, and stayed inside their homes as much as possible. This change was not just about fear, it was a way to try to protect themselves from getting sick. But it also created a sense of loneliness and separation that was hard to deal with. The world had become quieter, and the usual sounds of life were replaced by silence and uncertainty. People missed the comfort of being close to others, but they could not risk being near them. The way people interacted with each other changed in many ways. Friends no longer met in the streets, neighbors did not visit each other's houses, and children played alone instead of with others. The usual routines of daily life were disrupted, and people had to find new ways to live without the comfort of close relationships. Some people found it difficult to adjust, and they felt lost without the support of those around them. The world had become quieter, and the noise of everyday life had been replaced by silence and uncertainty. Without the presence of others, many people struggled to feel connected to the world around them. Isolation became a common way of life. People locked their doors, covered windows, and tried to keep their homes free from outside influences. They did not want to let the illness in, so they made sure that no one entered without being carefully watched. This led to a growing sense of distrust between people. No one knew who might be carrying the sickness, and this fear made it hard to trust anyone. Even those who were healthy were treated with suspicion, and this added to the tension in communities. People who had once been kind and open now hesitated to offer help, afraid that they might bring the illness into their own homes. The changes in social behavior affected more than just how people moved through the world, they also changed how they thought about each other. People who had once been friendly and helpful now hesitated to offer help. They worried that by helping someone else, they might bring the illness into their own home. This made it harder for people to support each other, and it created a sense of isolation that was hard to overcome. Without the support of others, many people struggled to cope with the loss and suffering around them. The emotional weight of the illness was heavy, and the lack of connection made it even harder to bear. The way people dressed and behaved also changed. Some people wore masks or covered their faces when they went outside, thinking that this would protect them from the illness. Others avoided touching anything that had been touched by another person, even if they had no reason to believe it was dangerous. These actions were based on fear, but they also showed how deeply the illness had affected daily life. People were no longer able to move freely, and their actions were guided by the need to stay safe, even if it meant living in constant worry. Every small decision carried the weight of survival, and every moment was filled with the possibility of danger. In some places, entire villages closed their gates and refused to let outsiders in. This was done to prevent the illness from spreading further, but it also made it harder for people to get supplies or help. Those who lived inside these walls had to rely on what they already had, and this created a sense of scarcity and hardship. Some people left their homes to find safety elsewhere, but this only helped the illness move to new areas. The more people moved, the more the disease spread, making it even harder to control. The efforts to protect themselves sometimes made the situation worse, and the cycle of fear and movement continued. The changes in society also affected how people saw themselves. Many people felt guilty for not being able to help others, and they worried that they might be responsible for spreading the illness. This guilt added to the emotional burden that people carried every day. They were not only dealing with the fear of getting sick, but also with the pain of watching others suffer and knowing that they could not do much to stop it. The weight of responsibility and helplessness was heavy, and it shaped the way people viewed their place in the world. Over time, the isolation and changes in behavior became a normal part of life. People adapted to the new way of living, even though it was not easy. They learned to survive without the company of others, and they found ways to cope with the loneliness that came with it. But even as they adjusted, the fear of the illness remained, and it continued to shape the way they lived and thought about the world around them. The struggle was not just against the disease, it was also against the changes it brought to society itself. The world had changed, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. Efforts to prevent infection. People tried many different ways to stop the illness from spreading. They believed that if they kept their homes clean, they would be safer. They scrubbed the floors, washed their clothes, and removed anything that might carry the sickness. Some people burned old items or threw them away, thinking that this would help prevent the illness from returning. These actions were based on what they saw happening around them, but they did not always work. The disease continued to move through the land, and no one could find a way to stop it completely. Even with all the cleaning and burning, the illness found its way in, and people had to live with the constant fear of being infected. Some people thought that certain plants or herbs could protect them from getting sick. They used these in different ways. Some drank them, others rubbed them on their skin, and some carried them with them as a sign of protection. These remedies were passed down from older generations, and people believed that they had been used before to fight other illnesses. But none of these methods actually stopped the disease. The people who used them still became sick, and many of them died without knowing why. The belief in these remedies gave people hope, but it also made them feel more confused when nothing changed. They tried everything they could think of, but the illness still took lives, and this made them question whether any of their efforts had any real effect. There were also many ideas about how to stay safe outside the home. Some people avoided going to places where many people gathered, like markets or public squares. They stayed inside their houses most of the time, only leaving when they had to. Others tried to keep a distance from anyone who looked unwell, believing that staying away from sick people would keep them healthy. These efforts were meant to protect them, but they did not always work. The illness moved quickly, and even those who tried to avoid it often ended up getting sick anyway. This made people feel even more helpless, as they realized that no matter what they did, the disease was still coming for them. Some people believed that the illness was caused by bad air, so they tried to make their homes smell better. They burned incense, lit fires, and used strong-smelling substances to try to drive out the sickness. Others thought that the illness came from water, so they boiled their drinking water or avoided it altogether. These actions were based on what people thought they knew, but they did not stop the disease from spreading. The illness found its way into homes regardless of what people did, and this made them feel even more helpless. They watched as their efforts failed, and this added to the growing sense of despair that surrounded them. Many people tried to protect themselves by avoiding contact with others. They did not shake hands, did not sit close to each other, and did not share food or drinks. This created a sense of distance between people, making it harder for them to support each other. Without the comfort of human connection, many people felt lonely and afraid. The fear of the illness made it hard to trust others, and this added to the tension in communities. People who once lived together in harmony now watched each other carefully, unsure of who might be carrying the sickness. This isolation made it harder to care for the sick, and it left many people feeling abandoned and alone. There were also attempts to isolate the sick. Some families sent their sick members to live in separate rooms or buildings, hoping that this would keep the illness from spreading to others. Others built walls around their homes or set up barriers to prevent anyone from entering. These efforts were meant to protect the healthy, but they also made it harder for the sick to get care. Without proper help, many of them suffered alone, and some of them died without being able to receive any real treatment. The isolation created more suffering, and it made the illness even harder to deal with. People were forced to choose between protecting themselves and helping those who needed them most. Some people tried to use religious practices to protect themselves. They prayed for safety, read holy texts, and visited sacred places, believing that these actions would keep them from getting sick. Others made small offerings or performed rituals, thinking that these acts would bring them protection. These beliefs gave people a sense of control, even if they did not stop the illness. The fear of the disease made people turn to faith more than ever, and this helped them cope with the uncertainty of what was happening around them. Even though the illness continued to spread, they found comfort in their beliefs, and this gave them the strength to keep going. Despite all these efforts, nothing really worked. The illness continued to spread, taking more lives each day. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing changed the outcome. The disease was powerful, and it did not care about what people did to protect themselves. Even those who followed all the rules and took every precaution still ended up getting sick. This made it clear that the illness was something beyond their control, and it forced people to face the reality that they could not stop it on their own. The struggle was not just about finding a solution, it was about surviving in a world that had changed forever. The efforts to prevent infection showed how much people wanted to survive, but they also revealed how little they understood about the disease. They tried everything they could think of, but none of it helped. The illness moved forward, and people had to live with the knowledge that they could not stop it. The struggle was not just against the disease itself, it was against the fear, the uncertainty, and the loss that came with it. Every day brought new challenges, and every night brought the same heavy silence of grief and sorrow. The world had changed, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The role of fear and uncertainty. Fear was a powerful force that shaped how people lived during the time of the illness. It moved through the land like the disease itself, spreading quickly and leaving behind confusion, panic, and doubt. People did not know where the sickness came from or how it spread, and this lack of understanding made them more afraid. Every new case of illness brought more worry, and every death added to the growing sense of dread that filled the air. Fear became a part of daily life, influencing decisions, actions, and even thoughts. The uncertainty about the illness made it hard for people to plan or act with confidence. They did not know when the next person would fall ill, nor did they know how long the sickness would last. This unknown future created a deep sense of helplessness. Some people stopped going outside, believing that staying inside would keep them safe. Others avoided others, thinking that by keeping their distance, they could protect themselves. But no one knew if these actions were truly helping, and this doubt only increased the fear. People lived in a constant state of anxiety, always wondering if they had done enough to stay safe. Fear also affected how people treated each other. Trust between neighbors and friends began to break down as people worried about who might be carrying the illness. Some families sent sick members away, not wanting to risk infecting others. Others refused to let anyone into their homes, even if it meant turning away those in need. These actions, while meant to protect, often caused more suffering. People who were already weak and sick found themselves alone, without care or support. The fear of the illness turned compassion into suspicion, making it harder for communities to come together in times of crisis. The emotional toll of the illness was immense. People watched as their loved ones fell ill and died, and this loss left deep scars on their hearts. Grief was everywhere, and it was difficult to find comfort in anything. Some people tried to cope by focusing on their faith, believing that God would protect them or that the illness was a test of their strength. Others turned to rituals, hoping that certain actions would bring them safety or relief. But even these efforts could not erase the pain. The fear of losing more people, of being the next to fall ill, kept many awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the morning would bring. The uncertainty also led to a breakdown in normal routines. Schools closed, markets became empty, and public gatherings were avoided. people no longer felt safe in places they once considered familiar. Even simple tasks, like buying food or visiting a neighbor, became dangerous choices. The fear of the illness changed the way people moved through the world, making them cautious, hesitant, and uncertain of everything around them. Life was no longer about enjoying the present, it was about surviving the next day. Some people tried to find meaning in the illness, believing that it was a punishment for past sins or a sign of something greater happening in the world. Others saw it as a test of character, a challenge that required patience and strength. These beliefs gave some people a sense of purpose, but they also added to the confusion. If the illness was a punishment, then what had they done wrong? If it was a test, then what was the lesson they needed to learn? These questions had no clear answers, and this lack of certainty only deepened the fear. The fear of the illness also affected how people thought about their own health. Many people started to believe that any small symptom was a sign of the sickness. A fever, a cough, or even a headache could send them into a panic. They checked their bodies constantly, looking for signs that they were getting sick. This hyper-awareness made it hard to relax, and it created a cycle of fear that was hard to break. People lived in a constant state of worry, always expecting the worst. Even those who were healthy felt the weight of the illness. They saw the suffering around them and wondered if they were next. They heard stories of entire families being wiped out, and this made them question their own safety. The fear was not just about getting sick, it was about losing everything that made life worth living. People lost their homes, their jobs, and their relationships, all because of an illness they could not understand. The uncertainty of the situation made it impossible to feel secure, no matter what they did. The role of fear and uncertainty in this time was undeniable. It shaped every aspect of life, from the way people acted to the way they thought. It created division, isolation, and despair, but it also forced people to confront their deepest fears. In a world where nothing was certain, people had to rely on their own strength, their own beliefs, and their own hope. The illness did not stop, but neither did the human spirit. Even in the face of fear, people continued to live, to try, and to survive. The struggle against the illness was not just about finding a cure, it was about finding a way to keep going, even when the future seemed uncertain and the present was full of pain. Long-term consequences. The long-term consequences of the illness were deep and far-reaching, affecting not only individuals but also entire communities and societies. As the disease continued to spread, it left behind a trail of loss, suffering, and change that would shape the future for generations. Families were broken, with many losing multiple members in a short time. The emotional scars of these losses remained long after the illness had passed, as people struggled to cope with grief and uncertainty. The absence of loved ones created a sense of emptiness that could not be filled, and this pain became a part of daily life for those who survived. Communities were also deeply affected by the illness. Many villages and towns saw their populations shrink as people died or left in search of safety. Some places became almost deserted, with empty homes and quiet streets that once bustled with life. This decline in population had serious economic and social consequences. With fewer people to work the land, manage businesses, or provide services, many areas faced hardship. Trade slowed, food production decreased, and the overall quality of life declined. People who had once lived together in close-knit communities now found themselves isolated, struggling to rebuild what had been lost. The illness also changed the way people viewed health and medicine. Before the outbreak, there was little understanding of how diseases worked, and treatments were often based on superstition or tradition. But as the illness spread and no one could find a cure, people began to question these old beliefs. Some started to look for new ways to understand and treat illness, leading to the gradual development of more scientific approaches. This shift in thinking laid the foundation for future medical advancements, even though it took many years for real progress to be made. Religious and cultural practices were also affected by the long-term impact of the illness. Many people turned to faith during the outbreak, believing that prayer, rituals, and divine intervention could protect them from the sickness. However, as the illness continued to take lives, some began to lose faith in these practices. Others became more devout, seeking comfort in their beliefs. The tension between faith and science grew over time, as people tried to make sense of what had happened and how to prevent such events from happening again. This conflict between tradition and knowledge would continue to shape society for many years. The psychological effects of the illness were also significant. Many people developed a deep fear of illness, which influenced their behavior for years to come. They avoided contact with others, stayed indoors more often, and were hesitant to trust strangers. This fear extended beyond the immediate threat of the disease and affected how people interacted with each other. Trust was broken, and relationships were strained as people became more cautious and suspicious. Even after the illness had passed, the memory of its impact lingered, creating a lasting sense of unease. Economically, the long-term consequences of the illness were severe. With so many people dead or displaced, labor shortages became a major problem. Fields went untended, and businesses struggled to stay open. This led to increased poverty and hardship, especially in rural areas where people relied heavily on agriculture. In some regions, entire industries collapsed, and people were forced to find new ways to support themselves. This economic instability had ripple effects across society, making it difficult for people to recover and rebuild. Social structures were also disrupted by the illness. Traditional roles and responsibilities were altered as families were forced to adapt to new circumstances. Children who had lost parents had to grow up faster, taking on adult responsibilities before they were ready. Women, in particular, faced new challenges as they took on roles that had previously been held by men. These changes helped to reshape the way society functioned, but they also brought about new difficulties and uncertainties. The long-term consequences of the illness also included a greater awareness of public health. As people saw the devastation caused by the disease, they began to recognize the importance of hygiene, cleanliness, and preventive measures. This awareness led to changes in how communities were organized and how people lived. Public health initiatives, such as better sanitation and quarantine practices, became more common, even if they were still limited in scope. These efforts, while not always effective at the time, laid the groundwork for future improvements in public health systems. The illness also had a lasting impact on the way people thought about death. Before the outbreak, death was a natural part of life, but the sheer scale of the loss made it more difficult to accept. People were forced to confront the reality of mortality in a way they had not before, and this changed the way they viewed life and the future. Funerary practices, mourning traditions, and religious beliefs around death evolved as people sought ways to cope with the overwhelming loss. In the years following the outbreak, the lessons learned from the illness began to influence how people prepared for future threats. While the disease itself was eventually controlled, the fear it left behind remained. Communities became more cautious, and governments started to pay more attention to public health and disease prevention. Although these efforts were still in their early stages, they marked an important step toward a more organized and informed approach to managing health crises. The long-term consequences of the illness were not just physical or economic, they were also deeply personal. For those who had lost loved ones, the pain never fully went away. For those who had survived, the experience changed the way they lived and the way they viewed the world. The illness had taken much from them, but it had also taught them resilience, strength, and the importance of community. Even in the face of great loss, people found ways to move forward, to rebuild, and to remember those who had been taken. The legacy of the illness was not just in the damage it caused, but in the lessons it left behind, shaping the future of Europe in ways that would be felt for generations to come. The search for a cure. As the illness continued to spread, people began to look for ways to stop it. They did not know what caused the disease or how to treat it, but they were determined to find a solution. Some believed that if they could understand the illness better, they might be able to prevent it or cure it. Others thought that there was a secret remedy hidden in nature, waiting to be discovered. These ideas led to many attempts to find a way to fight the disease, even though most of them failed. Doctors and healers tried different treatments, hoping that something would work. Some used bloodletting, believing that removing blood from the body would help the sick feel better. Others gave patients strong herbal mixtures, thinking that these could strengthen their bodies and fight off the illness. But none of these methods worked well, and many people still died despite the efforts. The lack of scientific knowledge made it hard to know which treatments were useful and which were not, so people had to rely on guesswork and tradition. Some people turned to religious practices, believing that prayer and faith could bring healing. They visited holy places, read sacred texts, and performed rituals in hopes that the illness would leave them alone. Others made small offerings, thinking that these acts would please the gods and protect them from harm. While these beliefs gave some people comfort, they did not actually stop the disease from spreading. The illness continued to take lives, and people had to face the reality that no amount of prayer or ritual could change the outcome. There were also many superstitions about how to avoid getting sick. Some people believed that certain foods or drinks could protect them from the illness. Others avoided going outside when the wind blew in a particular direction, thinking that the sickness traveled with the air. Some thought that if they stayed inside all day, they would be safe. These ideas varied from place to place, but they all came from the same place: fear and a lack of understanding. People wanted to believe that there was something they could do to stay healthy, even if it was just a small gesture. Despite all these efforts, nothing really stopped the illness. It continued to move through the land, taking more lives each day. People who followed these beliefs often felt confused when the illness still came to them. This led to more fear and more questions about what was happening. Some people began to doubt their own beliefs, wondering if there was something else they could do to stay safe. The more they tried, the more they realized that their methods were not working, which only increased their frustration. The search for a cure led to new ideas and experiments. Some people started to study the illness more closely, trying to find patterns in how it spread. They watched the sick and recorded their symptoms, hoping that this information could help them find a solution. Others looked at the behavior of animals and plants, thinking that nature might hold the key to stopping the disease. These early attempts at observation and analysis were the first steps toward a more scientific approach to medicine, even though they were still limited by the knowledge of the time. There were also efforts to isolate the sick, believing that this would prevent the illness from spreading further. Some families sent their sick members to live in separate rooms or buildings, hoping that this would keep the disease from affecting others. Others built walls around their homes or set up barriers to prevent anyone from entering. These actions were meant to protect the healthy, but they also made it harder for the sick to get care. Without proper help, many of them suffered alone, and some of them died without being able to receive any real treatment. The isolation created more suffering, and it made the illness even harder to deal with. Some people tried to use religious practices to protect themselves. They prayed for safety, read holy texts, and visited sacred places, believing that these actions would keep them from getting sick. Others made small offerings or performed rituals, thinking that these acts would bring them protection. These beliefs gave people a sense of control, even if they did not stop the illness. The fear of the disease made people turn to faith more than ever, and this helped them cope with the uncertainty of what was happening around them. Even though the illness continued to spread, they found comfort in their beliefs, and this gave them the strength to keep going. Despite all these efforts, nothing really worked. The illness continued to spread, taking more lives each day. People tried everything they could think of, but nothing changed the outcome. The disease was powerful, and it did not care about what people did to protect themselves. Even those who followed all the rules and took every precaution still ended up getting sick. This made it clear that the illness was something beyond their control, and it forced people to face the reality that they could not stop it on their own. The struggle was not just about finding a solution, it was about surviving in a world that had changed forever. The search for a cure showed how much people wanted to survive, but it also revealed how little they understood about the disease. They tried everything they could think of, but none of it helped. The illness moved forward, and people had to live with the knowledge that they could not stop it. The struggle was not just against the disease itself, it was against the fear, the uncertainty, and the loss that came with it. Every day brought new challenges, and every night brought the same heavy silence of grief and sorrow. The world had changed, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The end of the outbreak. The outbreak did not end in a single moment, but rather in a slow and uncertain way that left people still unsure of what had happened. It was not a sudden disappearance, nor was it marked by a clear turning point. Instead, the illness simply seemed to fade away over time, as if it had run out of people to take. Some said it had been stopped by the efforts of healers, others believed it had passed because of the prayers of the faithful, and some thought it had simply lost its strength. No one knew for sure, and this uncertainty added to the confusion that followed. As the illness began to decline, people were not sure how to react. Many had lived in fear for so long that they no longer knew how to feel safe again. They watched the streets with cautious eyes, waiting for the next sign of sickness, but nothing came. The silence that followed was strange, almost unnatural. For years, the world had been filled with the sound of crying, the sight of empty homes, and the weight of loss. Now, there was only quiet, and this quiet brought both relief and doubt. Some communities celebrated the end of the outbreak, believing it was a sign of divine favor or a reward for their suffering. They held small gatherings, lit fires, and sang songs of gratitude, hoping to mark the moment as a victory. Others remained cautious, afraid that the illness might return at any time. They kept their doors closed, avoided strangers, and continued to live with the same fears that had shaped their lives for so long. The memory of the illness was too strong to be forgotten, and many people carried its shadow with them for years to come. The end of the outbreak also brought changes in how people viewed the world. Before, life had been full of uncertainty, and death had always been a possibility. But after the illness, people saw things differently. They understood the fragility of life in a way they never had before, and this made them more aware of the value of health and safety. Some families became more protective of their children, while others took more care in their daily routines. The experience had changed them, and even those who had survived found themselves thinking about life in a new way. In some places, the outbreak led to lasting changes in how people lived. Communities that had been affected by the illness became more cautious, and this caution influenced how they built their homes, managed their food, and interacted with others. Some villages built walls around their homes, not just to keep out the sick, but to create a sense of security that had been lost during the outbreak. Others developed new traditions, such as regular cleaning rituals or special prayers for protection, as a way to remember what had happened and to prevent it from happening again. The medical field also changed in the years following the outbreak. Doctors and healers, who had once relied on superstition and guesswork, began to look for more practical ways to understand and treat illness. They studied the patterns of the disease, recorded what they saw, and tried to find connections between different cases. These early efforts laid the foundation for future medical discoveries, even though they were still limited by the knowledge of the time. The outbreak had shown that the old ways were not enough, and this realization helped to push medicine in a new direction. Religious beliefs also shifted in the wake of the illness. Some people turned to faith more than ever, believing that the outbreak had been a test of their devotion. Others, however, questioned their beliefs, wondering why the illness had taken so many lives despite their prayers and rituals. This conflict between faith and science would continue for many years, shaping the way people thought about health, healing, and the role of religion in society. The illness had challenged long-held ideas, and this challenge would have a lasting impact on the world. The emotional toll of the outbreak was not something that could be easily undone. Many people still carried the grief of those they had lost, and the pain of their memories lingered in their hearts. Some found comfort in remembering the lives that had been taken, while others struggled to move forward. The illness had left scars on individuals, families, and entire communities, and these scars would remain for generations. Even as life returned to normal, the past could not be erased, and the lessons learned from the outbreak would shape the future in ways that were not always visible. Despite everything, people found a way to rebuild. They started fresh, planting crops, rebuilding homes, and reaching out to each other in ways that had been difficult during the outbreak. The world had changed, but it had not ended. Life went on, and with it came hope. People remembered the suffering, but they also remembered the strength it had shown. They had survived, and this survival gave them a sense of purpose that would carry them forward. The end of the outbreak was not a happy moment, nor was it a complete victory. It was a moment of change, of reflection, and of quiet resilience. The illness had taken much, but it had also taught people something valuable. They had learned to be careful, to be kind, and to be grateful for the time they had. They had seen the worst of what life could bring, but they had also seen the best of what people could do when faced with hardship. In the years that followed, the story of the outbreak became part of history, passed down through stories, writings, and traditions. It was not just a tale of illness, but a tale of survival, of loss, and of the human spirit. The people who had lived through it carried its memory with them, and in doing so, they ensured that the lessons of the outbreak would not be forgotten. The world had changed, but so had the people who lived in it. And in the end, that was the most important thing of all.